The operational directive, the unprecedented strike, and the legal shift. The year is 2025, and the relationship between Washington and Caracas is at a breaking point. Fueling this tension is the Trump administration's direct accusation that the Venezuelan government is a major source of global drug trafficking. A dramatic escalation occurred when the U.S. placed a massive $50 million reward for information leading to the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. This set the tone for the unprecedented military deployment that followed, seeing over 8 warships and thousands of personnel positioned strategically in the Caribbean Sea. The moment of fire. On the night of October 3, 2025, the situation erupted. 6 advanced American fighter jets, a mixture of F-15 and F-18 aircraft, were dispatched with a single clear directive: eliminate a suspected Venezuelan narco convoy vessel. This was the key break from tradition. Standard protocol for the U.S. Coast Guard mandates seizure and arrest. However, the rules of engagement had been radically altered for this mission. The objective was annihilation, not capture. The result was immediate and lethal. Precision ordnance struck the small vessel, turning it into a burning ruin and killing at least 4 individuals designated as narco-terrorists. This strike was part of a relentless series of actions that may have resulted in over 27 casualties during that operational window. The legal coup d'état, a new kind of war. The true escalation was not kinetic but legal. Shortly after the strikes, the Trump administration formally informed Congress that the U.S. was now engaged in a non-international armed conflict against the organizations they were targeting. This declaration provided the military with the necessary legal framework to justify the lethal engagement. By classifying the drug traffickers as combatants in an armed conflict, the U.S. bypassed the civilian law enforcement standard of arrest and legitimized the use of immediate, lethal force. This controversial legal maneuver opened the floodgates for international debate, positioning the incident not as a simple drug bust, but as the quiet beginning of a major political and military crisis. Strategic evaluation, the backfire, Maduro's political masterstroke, the extrajudicial killing controversy. The military success of sinking the vessels was immediately eclipsed by the intense legal backlash. Critics, particularly international legal scholars, vehemently questioned the legality of the attacks. They argued that the designation of an armed conflict was a massive overreach, intended solely to justify the use of fighter jets and lethal force. The fate of the men killed, allegedly executed without due process, was fiercely debated, with many labeling the acts as extrajudicial killings outside the bounds of established legal norms. This criticism was fueled by a lack of U.S. transparency regarding the intelligence and rules of engagement. The core legal challenge remains: does drug trafficking, even when linked to a hostile regime, justify the full, lethal force of a superpower's air fleet? Caracas's fury and the sovereignty line. Venezuela's response was predictable in its fury, but strategically brilliant in its execution. The government in Caracas unequivocally condemned the U.S. jet activity, calling it a direct violation of national sovereignty and an act of illegal infringement. Their primary claim was that U.S. fighters were conducting illegal intrusions within the 75-kilometer limit of their territorial waters. This created the necessary pretext for escalation. Maduro mobilizes the nation against invasion. President Nicolas Maduro seized the moment to full political effect. He did not just issue a verbal protest. Instead, he ordered extensive new military exercises, placing them specifically in the nation's largest urban centers and slums. The mobilization was comprehensive, involving the military, police, and, crucially, the heavily armed civilian militias. Maduro's public rationale was explicit: preparation for an imminent American invasion. This response immediately shifted the global narrative. Maduro successfully framed the U.S. counter-narcotics operations not as law enforcement, but as a hostile prelude to regime change. The military drills were designed less for actual combat and more for a national psychological show of unity and political strength against a foreign aggressor. This demonstration of national solidarity, spurred by the U.S. military action, inadvertently served to consolidate Maduro's control and garner domestic support. Final assessment: the dangerous precedent and the future of conflict, the irony of the maximum pressure campaign. The strikes must be viewed as the sharp end of the Trump administration's comprehensive maximum pressure strategy against Caracas. The core aim was to sever the financial lifelines of the Maduro regime, which the U.S. claimed relied heavily on drug trafficking revenue. The switch from slow, bureaucratic interdiction to immediate, lethal destruction was a strategic choice for maximum deterrence and rapid financial impact. The logic was simple: destroy the revenue stream to accelerate the regime's collapse. The strategic failure of tactical victory. However, this tactical victory concealed a profound strategic failure. The U.S. successfully sank the convoys, but the political fallout, the ensuing controversy over the legality of the strikes, and Maduro's subsequent national mobilization ultimately strengthened the Venezuelan leader's domestic standing. The decision to use 6 U.S. fighters set a precedent that allowed the enemy to define the battlefield. The legacy of legal ambiguity. Redefining warfare. The most significant and long-lasting consequence of this operation is the legal precedent established by the Non-International Armed Conflict Declaration. By applying the laws of armed conflict to a loosely defined criminal/terrorist network, the U.S. fundamentally altered the landscape of international security. This move has massive global implications. 1. Empowerment of lethal force. It grants sovereign states the legal basis to use their military's full lethal capabilities against non-state actors outside their borders, without the necessity of a formal war declaration. 2. Erosion of due process. It justifies lethal engagement without judicial process, moving the decision of life and death from the courts to military command. 3. Blurring the lines. It dangerously blurs the traditional lines separating counterterrorism, law enforcement, and acts of war, making future conflict resolutions exponentially more complex. The destruction of the Narco Convoy vessels, therefore, was not merely an event. It was a watershed moment that legally redefined the scope of executive military power and, in doing so, allowed the entire situation to get worse on a geopolitical scale. Tactical priority, intelligence, retaliation risk, and the F-15 mission, the precision of intelligence, the deployment of the advanced U.S. plank. Fighter jets was entirely reliant upon highly refined and specific intelligence. This was not a random interdiction, but a targeted military operation. The jets were dispatched with real-time tracking data, suggesting a deep, sophisticated surveillance capability targeting the logistical and financial nodes of the narco-terrorist network. The destruction of the ships was intended to create chaos within the network, disrupting the chain of command and forcing key figures into retreat or exposure. The video evidence released by the U.S. was a calculated move, aimed at validating the intelligence and the necessity of the decisive, lethal force. The calculus of retaliation and risk. The tactical success of the strikes was immediately weighed against the inevitable risk of retaliation. Narco-terrorist groups, by nature, operate with extreme ruthlessness and often respond to maximum pressure with violence aimed at civilian or diplomatic assets. The heightened military exercises ordered by Maduro were not just political theater. They were a genuine response to the fear that the conflict could spill over into the national territory through asymmetrical attacks or border clashes. The stakes were raised exponentially, making the initial decision to authorize the strikes a profound long-term risk for regional security. The U.S. acceptance of the non-international armed conflict framework signaled its willingness to accept this increased risk. The F-15 versus narco vessel paradox. The most striking visual contradiction remains the use of high-tier F-15 and F-18 fighters, aircraft designed for high-speed, air-to-air combat and strategic bombing, to destroy small, low-value trafficking vessels. This paradox highlights the strategic shift. The F-15 was used not because a high-value asset was needed, but because the mission itself was classified as a high-value, high-risk military engagement under the new rules of engagement. The airframes themselves became symbols of the escalation, demonstrating an overwhelming commitment to the annihilation of the threat rather than merely its suppression. This image, the might of the U.S. Air Force turned on a tiny boat, is the core visual narrative that makes the event so compelling and so controversial. Conflict resolution, the legacy of contradiction, and the final lessons. The final standoff, political victory over tactical victory. The full story of the 2025 Caribbean conflict is a cautionary tale of modern warfare. The immediate destruction of the narco convoys by the 6 U.S. fighters achieved a tactical objective: disruption of criminal finances. Yet, the ultimate price was paid in political capital and legal precedent. President Maduro's strategic mobilization and successful framing of the conflict as a defense against American invasion proved to be the more enduring victory, consolidating his power and strengthening his domestic base. This demonstrates how, in asymmetric conflict, the narrative often trumps the military outcome. The core lesson for global security. The critical lesson for global security is the danger of strategic ambiguity and the power of legal semantics. The U.S. decision to unilaterally classify its action as a non-international armed conflict against a narco-terrorist network fundamentally alters the post-9/11 security landscape. This legal shift is the reason the situation got worse, as it legitimized unilateral, lethal military force against non-state groups worldwide, setting a precedent that is both powerful and potentially destabilizing. The long-term consequence is that this single military operation, intended to stabilize the region, may have inadvertently made international law a secondary concern in the face of perceived national threats. The entire incident serves as a chilling example of the immense risks inherent when the lines between law enforcement and military action are deliberately blurred.